Hey, good morning, everybody. We're going to jump right into this. I'm not going to delay too much. It's a little bit of a wordy set of notes. So, as soon as we jump in this, we'll get going so that we can get done quickly. You guys are already familiar with the module because I opened it up early, so you guys started some of the lessons. Some of you are done with them. So, we'll jump right into this so you guys can see the notes. All right, so we're still talking about cellular respiration. We're now on the second lesson of the fourth module. So we're on module 4, lesson 2, and we'll jump right into it and get it done as quick as possible. So now we're looking at respiration, but we're going to do an in-depth look. Last time we kind of did a quick overview, so now let's go into the details. All chemical equations require energy to get started. This is true of even for energy producing reactions like the ones we're talking about for cellular respiration. Although energy is needed to kind of kickstart the reaction, the overall net gain of energy is accomplished when we're breaking down glucose. This is similar to the idea of starting a business. It takes a little bit of money to make money, or even starting a fire for that matter. You got to light a match to start a bigger fire, and you get a larger net output once you kind of strike that match with a little bit of activation energy, is what they call it. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get right into this. What is the first stage of aerobic respiration? The first stage is going to be called glycolysis, and this is kind of where we use a little bit of energy to get this whole thing started, right? The first stage of cellular respiration is glycolysis. It does not require oxygen. It takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell outside the mitochondria. Because glycolysis is universal, whereas other parts of the aerobic respiration are not, most biologists consider it to be the most fundamental and primitive pathway for making energy. It's probably what evolved first, right? The word glycolysis simply means glucose splitting, which is exactly what happens in this stage. Enzymes split glucose into molecules called pyruvate. So if you take a look, you'll see that the C6 right here is the glucose molecule. We use about 2 ATPs to get this reaction kickstarted, and we end up with two 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. And in so doing, we produce something called NADP or NADH, and we actually produce a net gain of 2 ATP. So we produce 4 ATP, we use 2 up, which means we have a net gain of plus 2. So energy is needed for the start of glycolysis to split glucose molecules into 2-pyruvate, which go on to stage 2 of cellular respiration, which we'll cover in a moment. The energy to split glucose is provided by 2 molecules of ATP. As glycolysis proceeds, energy is released, and the energy is used to make 4 molecules of ATP. As a result, there's a net gain of 2 molecules during glycolysis. During this stage, high energy electrons are also transferred to molecules of NAD, making NADH, which is very similar to what we talked about with photosynthesis with NADH2 or FADH. The energy carrying molecule NADH is used in stage 3 of cellular respiration to make more ATP, as we're going to see. So let's move on to the second stage of aerobic respiration. The 2 molecules of pyruvate created during glycolysis will now enter stage 2 of respiration, and this is called the Krebs cycle. This stage happens inside the mitochondria and requires oxygen. Before the Krebs cycle begins, pyruvic acid, which has 3 carbons, is split apart and combined with an enzyme known as CoA, which stands for coenzyme A. And the product of this reaction is a 2-carbon molecule called acetyl-CoA. The third carbon from pyruvic acid combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, which is one of the byproducts we have during cellular respiration. When acetyl-CoA combines with a 4-carbon molecule called OAA, this produces something called citric acid, which is also what this is called. It's not always called the Krebs cycle. It can be called the citric acid cycle as well. This has 6 carbon atoms. This is why the Krebs cycle is also called the citric acid cycle. After citric acid forms, it goes through a series of reactions that release energy. The energy is captured into molecules of NADH, ATP, and FADH2. All of these are energy-carrying compounds. Carbon dioxide is also released as a waste product during this part of the reaction, just like it was before. 2 turns are needed because glycolysis produces 2 pyruvic acid molecules. When it splits glucose apart, after the second turn through the Krebs cycle, the original glucose molecule has been broken down completely. All 6 of its carbon atoms have been combined with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. The energy from this chemical bonds has been stored in a total of 16 energy-carrying molecules. These molecules are 4 more molecules of ATP. This includes 2 from glycolysis. So when you look at it, we get 2 ATP from glycolysis and 2 ATP from the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. Then we made a whole bunch more of these NADH, including 2 from glycolysis, and then a couple of FADH2. And what you can think about as far as these NADHs and FADH2s is they're kind of like money in the bank. We can use these energy-carrying molecules in the next step to get a whole bunch more ATP. So let's move on to the third step. At the end of the Krebs cycle, energy from the chemical bonds of glucose is stored in a diverse energy molecule 4 ATP, but also 2 FADH2s and 10 NADH molecules. The primary task of the last stage of cellular respiration is the electron transport chain. And this is to transfer energy from the electron carriers to even more ATP molecules, the batteries, which basically work within the cell. So if you take a look, this is the electron carrier. We're going to take all these NADHs and FADH2s and break them apart, releasing energy, and we're going to pump these hydrogen ions to one side of the cell, or the membrane, I should say, within the mitochondria. It's not inside the cell, but inside the mitochondria. As we pump all these hydrogen ions across that membrane, it causes something called a high hydrogen ion concentration gradient. And all these hydrogen ions want to go from areas where there's a whole bunch of them in this inner membrane space to where there's very few of them, which is inside the matrix of the mitochondria. And the only way to do that is they have to rush through another enzyme called ATP synthase. And as they do that, ATP synthase kind of generates this ATP. And there's some good videos in the module on Canvas to kind of look through this and watch. So pathways for making ATP in stage 3 of aerobic respiration closely resemble the electron transport chain used in photosynthesis. In both electron transport chains, energy carrier molecules are arranged in a sequence within a membrane so that the energy carrying electrons cascade from one another, losing a little energy each step. In both photosynthesis and aerobic respiration, the energy lost is harnessed to pump hydrogen ions into a compartment, creating an electrochemical gradient or chemiosmotic gradient across the enclosed membrane. And in both processes, the energy stored in the chemiosmotic gradient is then used to run ATP synthase to build ATP. For aerobic respiration, an electron transport chain or respiratory chain is embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. The FADH2 and the NADH molecules produced in glycolysis in the Krebs cycle donate their high energy electrons to the energy carrier molecules within the membrane. As they pass from one carrier to another, the energy they use is used to pump hydrogen ions into the mitochondrial intermembrane space, creating an electrochemical gradient. Hydrogen ions then flow down the gradient from the outer to the inner compartment and go through an ion channel enzyme called ATP synthase, which transfers their energy to ATP. And I'll be honest with you, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, so some of the animations that you can see on Canvas, and you can look some up as well. You can look up some other animations. You can type in electron transport chain animation into Google and find lots of different animations that kind of explain this process. After passing through the electron transport chain, low energy electrons and low energy hydrogen ions combine with oxygen to form water, which is the other byproduct. Thus, oxygen's role is to drive the entire set of ATP producing reactions within the mitochondria by accepting the spent hydrogen. So they are basically the final electron acceptor within the electron transport chain. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor. No part of the process from the Krebs cycle through the electron transport chain can happen without oxygen being present. That's why it's called aerobic respiration. You need oxygen. Aerobic respiration is complete if oxygen is available. Cellular respiration transfers the energy from one molecule of glucose to 38 molecules of ATP, releasing carbon dioxide and water as a waste product. Deliverable food energy has become energy in which we can use to actually do work with inside the cell, move things around, cause a muscle contraction, you name it. Everything that's done in your body is going to require ATP. Transport within the cell, pumping ions, molecules across the membrane, building large organic molecules, etc., all has to have ATP present. All right, so let's go through this and let's look at a couple of possible things that could happen if there is no oxygen present. There's two types of fermentation we're going to mention, and I told you, I think I briefly mentioned this in the earlier set of notes on this module for lesson 1. And I said that would be a conversation for later, and here it is. Anaerobic respiration is a form of cellular respiration that occurs without the need for oxygen. The first step is always glycolysis. So it's the same, right? It's the same reaction we saw when we were talking about aerobic respiration, except this is going to be anaerobic, which means no oxygen. A molecule of glucose is broken down into two pyruvate molecules, just like before, and then depending on the types of organisms, the next step in our anaerobic respiration will differ. So in certain organisms, like ourselves, when our muscles are working, for example, um, we don't do alcohol fermentation. We do something called lactic acid fermentation. So when we're looking at this, right, you have this thing called lactic acid fermentation that can occur. And it builds up this stuff called lactate. Now, the good news is this is a reversible reaction. If you take a look, there's 3 carbons here. There's 3 carbons here. We're just arranging them, the atoms on the outside of these carbons in a different way to release a little bit more energy and to get a little bit more ATP. We can take this lactic acid and very easily convert it back to pyruvic acid once oxygen becomes available and then go through the rest of aerobic respiration. In other organisms, it's irreversible. It's called alcohol fermentation. Organisms like yeast can do this. So you have alcohol fermentation, which has 3 carbons. But in this process, we lose a carbon and make carbon dioxide, and we end up with this 2-carbon molecule called ethanol, which is basically a type of alcohol. So when we're using yeast to brew beer, for example, and produce the alcohol that's found in beer, that's basically what's happening. Now we can't get this carbon back and add it to this and reverse the process and go back to pyruvic. So this isn't considered an irreversible reaction. Matter of fact, it's a one-way reaction too, because once we do this enough and we build up this ethanol within the yeast, the ethanol actually ends up killing the organism. So it's kind of a self-destructive method too, because the alcohol concentration will eventually kill off the yeast. So let's look at these two a little bit more detail. Either the formation of alcohol or lactic acid will occur in order for more ATP to be produced. One advantage of lactic acid over alcohol fermentation is that once oxygen is available, lactic acid can be converted back to pyruvate to use in aerobic respiration for more energy, whereas alcohol, once formed, can't be converted back to pyruvate. So this is a one-way reaction. This one, we can reverse it and take this lactic acid and convert it back to pyruvate. So you may not have been aware that your muscles can ferment. They do lactic acid fermentation. Recall that glycolysis breaks glucose molecule into pyruvate molecules, producing a net gain of 2 ATP and 2 NADH. Lactic acid fermentation is a type of anaerobic respiration carried out by things like yogurt or bacteria or by your very own muscles when you're working them hard and fast. So if you're lifting weights, the reason you can't lift weights forever and keep bench pressing whatever you're bench pressing for an indefinite period of time is you have a buildup of lactate or a lack of oxygen being delivered to your muscles in time for you to continue that process. You start running out of energy. So your body goes into lactic acid, or your muscles go into lactic acid fermentation and converts in a brief period of time some 3-carbon pyruvate into 3-carbon lactic acid. That's also why your muscles get sore. The buildup of this lactic acid after you work out, the next day you get a little sore, your muscles are sore. It's because of this lactic acid buildup inside your muscles. And in this way, it's able to regenerate the NAD pluses in the process and allow glycolysis to kind of continue for a short period of time, making ATP in low oxygen conditions. Since there's a limited supply of NAD plus available in any given cell, this electron acceptor must be regenerated to allow ATP production to continue. To achieve this, NADH donates its extra electron to pyruvate, regenerating NAD, and then lactic acid is formed by the reduction of pyruvate. So, other organisms, for example, lactobacillus bacteria, the acid resulting from fermentation kills bacteria competitors in buttermilk, yogurt, cottage cheese. The benefits extend to humans who enjoy these foods, and we use them during this process of producing things like cheese and yogurt, etc. You may have noticed that this type of fermentation in your own muscles because muscle fatigue and pain are associated with the lactic acid that builds up. Lactic acid accumulates in your muscles as fermentation process during times of strenuous exercise. During these times, your respiratory and cardiovascular system cannot transport oxygen to your cells, especially those in your legs or your arms or your chest or whatever you're working out, fast enough for you to maintain aerobic respiration. To allow the continuous production of ATP, your muscle cells use lactic acid fermentation during this situation of low oxygen levels. So let's do alcohol fermentation really quick. Have you fueled your car with corn? Well, some cars are starting to be run on what's called biofuels, right? If you have bought gas within the city of Portland, Oregon, or Portland was one of the first cities to require that all gasoline sold within city limits contain at least 10% ethanol, which are produced by corn. By mid-2006, nearly 6 million flex fuel vehicles can use gasoline blends of up to 85% ethanol. We're traveling the U.S. roads. This new industry employs an old crew of yeast and bacteria to make ethanol by an even older biochemical pathway called alcohol fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation is a biochemical process in which sugars such as glucose, fructose, sucrose are converted into small amounts of ATP, producing ethanol and carbon dioxide as a byproduct. You probably are most familiar with the term fermentation in terms of alcoholic beverages. You may have not considered that the process is actually a chemical reaction certain bacteria and yeast use to make ATP, like lactic acid fermentation, alcohol fermentation, which is also referred to as ethanol fermentation, processes pyruvate one step further in order to regenerate the NAD+. So that glycolysis can continue to make ATP in low oxygen environments. This form of anaerobic respiration, pyruvate is broken down into ethyl alcohol and a carbon dioxide. Transforming pyruvate does not add to ATP to produce glycolysis, and for anaerobic respiration, the end of the ATP producing line. All types of anaerobic respiration yield only 2 ATP per glucose. The point of fermentation is basically to kind of regenerate the electron carrier NAD, and it allows basically that glycolysis to continue and produce a little bit more ATP after the fact. So what is this ATP we keep talking about? Well, here's a picture of it. It's got three phosphates attached to a sugar with an adenine here, okay? So ATP is basically a modified nucleotide adenosine with three phosphate molecules bonded to it. ATP molecules store smaller quantities of energy, but each release just the right amount of energy to actually do some work inside a cell. A muscle cell proteins, for example, pull each other with the energy released from the bonds of the ATP break open. So when these phosphates pop off, we're allowed to use that energy to kind of allow a muscle contraction or whatever else we need to happen inside our bodies. The process of photosynthesis, along with the light energy, also makes and uses ATP for energy to build glucose. And we looked at that in the previous lesson. ATP is then a usable form of energy for your cells, and ATP is commonly referred to as the energy currency. You can also think of this as a rechargeable battery. As these phosphates are left, we get less and less energy in this molecule, and then we can kind of recharge it during photosynthesis by adding phosphates to this, or through the breakdown of glucose during cellular respiration to add phosphates to this. So here's a quick comparison of aerobic and anaerobic respiration. I'll go through this rather quickly. Aerobic's down this line and anaerobic's over here. So which one uses oxygen? Aerobic uses oxygen, anaerobic does not. Type of cell, eukaryotic cells do this, prokaryotic cells do this, and some eukaryotic cells can do this when there's no oxygen available. For example, the muscle example with lactic acid fermentation. The amount of energy, we can get 36 to 38 ATP molecules here. For anaerobic, we're only going to get a net gain of 4 ATP. Actually, a net gain of 2, but 4 ATP are produced. The stages, you got glycolysis, Krebs, and electron transport chain for aerobic, glycolysis, and then you either have lactic acid or alcoholic fermentation. Products, we make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Over here, we make carbon dioxide, ATP, and either lactic acid or ethanol. And then the site, this happens in the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. This is only going to occur in the cytoplasm. And then the reactants, we're going to use glucose and oxygen. And over here, we're going to use glucose and electron acceptors other than oxygen. All right, so let's pair these two reactions, and we're getting close to the end. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are two reactions that are basically mirror images of one another. The reactants of photosynthesis, water and carbon dioxide, are the products in cellular respiration. The reactants of cellular respiration, sugar and oxygen, are the products of photosynthesis. So if you take the products and kind of flip them over to the left from photosynthesis, and then the reactants and flip them over to the right, and then you have basically the same reaction. So they're kind of opposites of one another, moving in one direction as opposed to the other. So this is a relationship between two reactions, and it's a driving factor. And there's a GIF that you can look at on Canvas. It didn't translate to the notes. So that GIF they're talking about kind of shows like a little chalkboard with these animations and what's going on. Make sure you take a look at that. Sunlight that reaches the earth is transformed into chemical energy in the form of sugar using carbon dioxide and water. Plants and animals break down that sugar with oxygen to make usable energy for cells. This process is called respiration release, and it releases carbon dioxide and water. The matter of carbon dioxide, water, and oxygen cycle through living things because of these two processes, photosynthesis and respiration. All right, so that takes us up to the assignments, and I already opened up these lesson to you guys last week. We did it early, so make sure you do all the self-checks for Module 4 Lesson 2 and all the videos for Module 4 Lesson 2. There's several of them. And then we had a real easy week for assignments. I kind of cut out some of the longer assignments to shorten it up, since we're going to be only on a one day or one class week this week with Thanksgiving. So Module 4 2.6 is the science notebook. You got to watch the videos and kind of respond to some writing prompts. And then Module 4 2.11 is the discussion board between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Make sure you do that. And then I'm also going to open up the cell respiration test, which kind of polishes off Module 4 and finishes that up. So you can do that as well. And I'll leave that open probably an extra few days, probably until midweek next week, Wednesday. That'll give you a little extra time. So you don't have to, you can do it before Thanksgiving, or you can do it, sometime after Thanksgiving, and you should be okay. All right, guys, so that's it. Hopefully this wasn't too wordy, and you'll get through this relatively easy. If you need help, make sure you come to one of the office hours, and I can help you with that. Have a good day.